It was the late 1990s, and Peggy was tired from her long commute from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. An inviting motel sat across a grassy hill in California City, and Peggy decided to embrace the warm and inviting vintage charm, hoping to get a peaceful night's sleep. However, it really wasn't meant to be. Peggy later described the scene as horrendous in an interview with Jason Offutt. Later that night, Peggy was settled in her cozy room, lazily watching VH1 when there was a knock on the door. As she approached the door and opened it as far as she could without removing the chain, she heard a man's voice asking for sheets, but saw nothing at the time. As she continued to survey the hall for the source of the voice, she suddenly realized what exactly she was looking at. There was no person outside speaking to her, but instead there was a huge cockroach. This creature was positioned as if it was standing and frantically cleaning its feet. It was about 6.5 feet tall. After she noticed it, it didn't take long for it to notice her too. Realizing it was being watched, the monstrous creature spat a brown substance at her. Horrified, Peggy screamed, prompting the bug to utter the word, "Why?" She didn't answer, thinking the best course of action would be to run past the monster. She opened the door and ran down the hall, passing the slumped body of an unfortunate motel worker. The vermin scuttled down the hall behind her. Just as she approached the exit, the monstrous creature caught up to her and grabbed her dress. It wrapped a double barbed hands around her wrists, antenna brushing against her face. Peggy's vision began to blur as she neared the point of fainting from fear, but just in time she remembered an action movie she had seen before and decided to imitate one of Chuck Norris's moves. She dropped her body down and used the momentum to kick the creature's ankles out from underneath it, then kicking it in the face. Peggy got up and started running in a sequence that seemed straight out of a horror movie. The cockroach also managed to get back on its feet to pursue its frightened prey. It almost caught up to her when she reached the door at the end of the hall. She opened it as fast as she could before immediately turning around and closing the door on one of the monster's antennae. The creature screamed loud, and unlike anything Peggy had ever heard before or since. As Peggy ran into the cold night, a young man happened to be nearby at a payphone who saw the monstrous creature chasing her. He probably couldn't believe his eyes, so he immediately called the police. Almost immediately, 2 police cars arrived, causing the mutant monsters to disappear out of sight over a nearby hill. Peggy ended her story by noting how quickly insects can reproduce. She said residents of the area have claimed to see things flying behind the trees, which made Peggy wonder if the huge cockroach that had traumatized her are now out of control, breeding in the California desert. Crescent was an alien creature that was said not only to be seen but also met face to face. The witness is a man named David Huggins, who claims to have met aliens at the age of 8 and even lost his virginity to a female alien named Crescent. As shown in David's paintings, there are many alien species such as a large mantis, a gray humanoid, and an ape-like creature with glowing yellow eyes. At the age of 17, he was on his way through the Georgia forest. David supposedly saw Crescent sitting next to a tree. She looked humanoid except for her big black eyes, pale pointed face, and wig. She undressed. He did the same thing and laid down. She got on top. They consummated the beginning of their long-term, very long-distance romance. crescent, as seen in many of David's paintings, resembles a typical gray alien. Undressed, she appears to have flesh-covered skin like a normal human and large human breasts. David claimed that she is considered one of the large women on her planet. David had 4 more encounters with aliens since then. In 1952, he had an encounter with the mantis, but like many of his encounters, they were not usually mentioned outside his paintings. However, the next officially documented meeting was in 1953 and was chronologically his 6th meeting. In this case, David took a well-worn path to visit a friend, and he walked through the field behind a barn. He had the feeling that he was being watched, but when he looked around, he saw no one. When David reached an area with several small bushes, he heard a strange sound that sounded like a cow mooing. And as he looked around expecting to see some of the family herd in the area, he noticed a dark gray figure rise from behind one of the bushes. When David looks at this unfamiliar form, he sees dark black, long, almond-shaped eyes staring back at him. Realizing it was some kind of creature, he then asked himself, is that a head? Are those eyes? David then suddenly became afraid as he did not know what the creature was. He soon saw that the figure also had a thin mouth and nose, and what he was looking at was indeed a head. Just then he felt another sense of being watched, this time from the opposite direction. As he looked at the bush behind him, another head peeked out. Suddenly he said, "Why is it so bright?" For everything around him seemed to light up much more than it should, and after that he fainted and curled up in a ball. In this state, several small creatures in blue jumpsuits approached him. Their faces were dark gray and had the same features as the creatures staring at him from the bushes. David didn't remember much in this state or what happened when he was surrounded by these creatures, but he clearly remembers hearing 3 loud beeps. The next thing he knew, he was standing chest deep in weeds with no memory of what happened or how he got there. He saw a figure approaching him. As it got closer, he realized it was his mother with a deeply concerned face. When she came to him, she told him that she was worried that something might have happened to him because he had been gone for over an hour and that his friend was still waiting for him. David could not tell her what happened and did not remember any of it. David's next documented encounter was the 9th and occurred in 1954. David was standing in the back of a field on his family's property looking for arrowheads when he felt the urge to look up at the sky. He saw several figures seemingly to fall from the sky. When he looked closer, he noticed that it was 9 to 8 small gray aliens in blue jumpsuits. He watched them all fall, and as soon as they hit the ground, they started running towards him. Terrified, he ran to the farmhouse. When he looked back, he saw the creatures were beginning to turn invisible, as if they did not know that David had seen them. Instead of going inside, he walked around the house and bent down, watching the now visible creatures approaching. He saw their feet on the other side. They stopped and turned and walked away from the house. David felt uneasy, but eventually went about his day and tried to sleep that night. That night, David woke up and approached the window. He looked up and noticed a large glowing object flying in front of the moon. Confused as to what the object could be, David began looking around for clues. He noticed that the same creature that had fallen from the sky earlier that day were standing outside watching him. He was afraid, but as soon as he saw them, his fear seemed to leave him. David watched as they walked up the stairs to the door of his room that led outside and watched with complete calm as the creatures entered his room. They moved forward to grab David and drag him outside. They forced him out, still held by the creatures. He began to float towards the ship. The UFO was a glowing oval shape. There were no windows or doors. It appeared to be just one solid object, but as he floated up, he and the other creatures somehow managed to enter the object. He found himself in a large metal room that reminded him of a doctor's office, and noted that the other creatures had apparently left him alone except for one gray that David recognized as a young boy, and he noticed a woman in the room. She was much taller than the gray. David looked at the gray and asked, "Is that your mom?" But he said nothing and only smiled at David's question. The woman soon began to approach David. She reached out and turned David's head back as Gray held David's arms to prevent him from resisting. The female took a rod and began shoving it into David's nose. This was very uncomfortable, and he began to resist as much as he could in his condition. This caused the female to push the device even harder into his cavity. David started crying as she removed the object and told her, "You hurt me." The woman said, "Let me see," and then started rubbing his nose. And when David looked into her black eyes, the pain and terror ceased. She leaned over David, and in doing so, David was partially aware that she was erasing the memory of the encounter. This was David's first encounter of this woman, but it would not be the last. This creature, which he later called Crescent, would make appearance during most of his life. Crescent was clearly a woman. David believed she wore a wig so she could seem more human. She had incredibly long fingernails, but the rest of her anatomy wasn't too different from a human woman. David sensed from the first meeting that Crescent was an old creature with an old soul. Years later, David would have many other and more exotic encounters with Crescent, many of which would change his life even more than a simple kidnapping. After Crescent left the room, David was approached by another alien in the room. The creature was incredibly tall and looked very human with a few exceptions. His eyes were bright red orange, and behind his bald head was a fleshy extension. The creature approached David and seemed to him to be the supervisor of the aliens, or at least some sort of authority on the ship. The creature took David to a large window where he saw he was in space. He saw Earth in the distance. The creature told him about things like Earth, space, and space travel. After that, David was taken back home, although he does not remember how or when it happened. When he woke up the next morning, his memories of the experience were gone, though he said he had a slight nosebleed. When these memories returned to him, David described what the aliens did to him, saying, "You know how we tag whales and stuff like that." One day, David was playing near the tool shed by his home when Crescent and the little gray appeared and pulled him towards them. David was in Crescent's arms, and she watched a large black snake slither out from under the shed. And on another occasion, David was swimming and almost drowned. When he was deep in the water, he saw a figure and heard a voice say, "Let him live." As soon as he heard the sound, he felt something touch his toe, which he could tell was some sort of root. David reached down and began to pull on the root, making his way to shore. Later, he saw a large female creature sat next to a tree. She had dark skin as opposed to pale or gray skin and was naked. She was waiting for me under the tree. She was female. When she opened her arms to greet me, there was something special about her. The being did not approach David, but instead sat silently watching him. He attempted to tell his parents about his experiences, but they were often treated as lies. When he was 10, he saw a tall being outside his window one night who just stood there looking at him with bright orange eyes. David went and told his father, and when his father went outside to investigate, he saw nothing and was angry with the boy, saying, "There is no one. Son, stop making things up," and his father beat him for lying. The next day, he was behind the house and saw Crescent and went up to her and said, "My mother and father won't believe me when I say I see you. I got a whipping." She said, "Then don't tell that." After that, David never talked about his encounters with his parents. On more than one occasion, David noticed an egg-shaped UFO landing on the ground near a tree. Out of curiosity, he walked towards the object and saw no doors or windows on any part of the object. On more than one occasion, David noticed an egg-shaped UFO landing on the ground near a tree. Out of curiosity, he walked towards the object and saw no doors or windows on any part of the object, but when he got very close to the craft, he recognized from an earlier encounter a creature who was holding a clear container with a gray baby inside. The stranger explained to David that he wanted him to pay attention to the baby and watch it carefully. At the time, however, David had no idea why he was being shown a baby. Perhaps the creatures were foreshadowing what they had planned for him. After David turned 11, he and his family moved. By the time they left their old homes with the last of their possessions, it was late. David was sitting in the back of the family's truck. As he looked out the window, he noticed something in the sky following them much further away. There, just beyond the tree line, a ship was flying in the same direction they were headed. David did not tell his family about his experience and did not remember any significant other encounters until he was 17 years old. When David was 17, he encounters these creatures for the 21st time. It was a summer day in 1961 when David was walking in the forest. He was on his way to hang out with friends at a nearby lake to beat the heat, and since it was a very hot and stormy day, he decided to wander under the shade of the forest until he could cool off in the lake. He was walking a little distance in the countryside. He happened to see a woman lying next to a tree, and she was immediately startled because he could tell that it was no ordinary woman. However, she stood up and approached him. He became worried. The woman, who was Crescent, the creature that had visited him many times in the past. She told him to lie down. Now very sexually excited, couldn't take his pants off fast enough. He fell flat on his back. Grass and Crescent and him became intimate. They were doing the act for a while when she looks at him. David reaches climax that is extraordinarily painful and powerful. At that moment, he lost his virginity and soon fainted as he lay there. He wakes up about 10 to 15 minutes later. He doesn't remember how he got there or why his pants and underwear were down and around his ankles. Not wanting to dwell on it, he pulled his pants and underwear up and continued on his way to the lake. When the memory came to him, David said, "I'd figure if anything I'd be losing it in the back seat of a Ford," something like that, but no, it didn't work that way at all. 2 weeks later, after the encounter, David woke up late one night and he saw a familiar face. There, the hairy man stood by his bed, telling him to get dressed and come outside. David obeyed and followed the creature as it led him through the forest to a large egg-shaped UFO hidden in a group of trees. The craft was approximately 15 feet long and emitted a soft but pulsing glow. As they approached the ship, David saw Crescent and the insect-like creature he had seen when he was a child. They were waiting for him in the front of the ship. The three creatures escorted David into the craft. However, he does not remember what happened while on it, except that he was told not to remember anything and that his memory was erased. After a while, David couldn't stand Georgia anymore. He felt that there was nothing there, and he had a strong desire to draw and paint. He started painting in 1966 and discovered he really enjoyed working with oils, painting landscapes, still lifes, and portraits. His family was far from accepting of his future profession, and on top of everything, his home life was slowly falling apart around him. His parents were alcoholics and fought occasionally. His father dated other women and took his struggles out on David and his siblings. He heard about the art Art Students League in New York and wanted to go there, he heard a voice saying, "If you don't leave now, you will never leave." He decided he would. He was 19 at the time and wrote a letter to his parents and left when they weren't there because he was sure they would stop him. David's encounters did not stop after he left Georgia for New York, and in many ways became more intense than what he had experienced as a boy. David's 26th meeting took place during the Great Traffic Strike of 1966, when neither buses nor subways were running. During this time, David was involved in the Art Students Union and got a job in the hardware store. It was Saturday afternoon, and while tidying the shelves, he noticed a man and a woman entering the store. These people did not go to the store to look at nails or tools, but stared at David intensely, who remained at the door, confused and somewhat annoyed by this. David stopped stalking the shelves and began approaching people, asking, "Can I help you?" The people did not answer, but looked at David more closely. Their eyes seemed hypnotic to David, and David could only repeat the same question he had already asked them. David was very annoyed by their lack of communication and general attitude, but before he could speak again, the couple turned and left the store without saying a word. That evening, David closed the store, and heavy rain fell over New York, and David, reluctantly realizing the strike would make it impossible to take a taxi, bus, or subway, he prepared for the inevitable wetness. When David got to Fifth Avenue, he was desperate to find a way out of the rain and decided, what the hell, why not hitch a ride? He waited a little with no luck until a big black car stopped next to him. The car window rose down, and David sees a woman in the driver's seat who asked him, "Where are you going?" David replied, "Ma'am, if you could take me to Central Park, I can walk the rest of the way home." She told him to get in, and they pulled into the street. In the car, they rarely spoke outside from the strike and commenting on the weather. However, while driving, David felt there was something else in the car, especially in the back seat, but for some reason he did not want to look. The woman drove David directly to his apartment. Much to his surprise, when leaving, David thanked her, saying, "Thank you very much for the ride. You saved me from a wet walk." She said nothing, just nodded, but then David looked into her eyes. He realized that her gaze had the same effect as the woman from the shop. That night, David saw her face in a dream. During that time, David felt like it was a dream, but he knew it was real. These dream visits took place for a month, and each night the face seemed more real and less visionary. They also progressed more and more each night during these dreams, and David was able to see more of his surroundings. At first, it was all just a woman in a dark room, but soon the glow began to shine from a corner. These visions vary from night to night. Some of them would be incredibly sharp and clear, while others would be hard to see. After a while, these dreams became significantly sexual, and David started calling these nightly visits sex dreams, but he realized that they were much more physical and real than any other wet dreams he had experienced before. During these sessions, it was revealed that he and Crescent would continue their sexual encounters, but unlike their first time, they were not alone in the corner, an insect-like creature always following the two of them. When morning came, David had his last interaction with the beings. He heard the phrase, "We will be back tonight." But when these words were spoken, David forgot the whole experience and considered every experience just a dream. One night during this time, the hairy guy came into the room and asked David, "Can we use your body?" David said, "Yes, you can use it as much as you want." The hairy guy seemed extremely happy with David's answer and disappeared. During this time, David had a girlfriend named Ethel, but it would be extremely short-lived because of the aliens. One night, Ethel woke up in her apartment to find a group of little men around her bed. Ethel was so traumatized by the experience that she immediately ran out of her bedroom screaming for help. Neighbors who heard her screams came to her aid. After walking back to the apartment, began to check for intruders, which they did not find, so she immediately packed all her things and moved home to Canada without telling David at all. David found out later one day while looking for her when a friend told him what had happened that night. David never saw her again. All those who intended to be romantic with David had similar experiences as Ethel. David points out that during his time in the art league, he had several people interested in him, and he went on dates with many different women. However, David never made it past a first date with anyone. Each woman found the same issue they couldn't pinpoint with him and rejected him while he looked elsewhere. It was as if some invisible mark had been placed on David that made him exclusive with the aliens. David had dream meetings with Crescent for at least 5 years. She visited him about 2 or 3 times a week. If Crescent was real, he needed proof of her existence. After he left his classes for the day, he started walking home. Passing a flower shop, he stopped at the window and saw pink flowers in the window and decided, I will bring her flowers. If she takes them tonight, I am sure she is real. If not, I will use the flowers as a model for a painting. This led to his 41st meeting with the creatures. When he got home, he put the flowers on the bookshelf and went to bed, saying aloud, these are for you, then fell asleep. The next morning, he forgot about the flowers, but before going to class, he passed the bookshelf and triggered a faint memory. He couldn't remember what. While at school, he visited a studio where floral arrangements were being painted in a watercolor class, and he watched his fellow students. He soon remembered his own purchase of flowers, and that when he left in the morning, they were no longer there. Crescent took the flowers away. On the way home, he realized they would be back tonight. So excited, he started cleaning his apartment, including the dishes. He would later say, it was like I was going on a date. We weren't going out, but we were on a date. That night, he noticed a strange object on the opposite of his bed. The object was about the size of a quarter, and David felt the strange energy fill his body. The energy seemed to alter his consciousness. Although he was alert and aware of himself and his surroundings, trying to figure out why he felt that way, he noticed that his apartment had become very quiet, untouched by the usual sounds of Manhattan. He kept his gaze on the quarter-sized object on the wall, watching as it slowly grew until it was clearly transparent. But was on the other side was something particularly strange. He noticed an insect-like creature walking from the glowing circle into his room. When the monster entered the room, another figure followed, which was Crescent, followed by 2 small grays. However, David was more focused on Crescent, and looking at her, he felt a pleasant energy towards her. David was still in bed at the time of the sudden intrusion into the room and watched as Crescent approached him. She sat down on the bed next to him and looked at him, then at the bookcase, then back at David, all smiling. He said in an interview one time, I turned on the radio, I figured we'll dance. She put her hand up to stop it as she didn't like it. I started humming instead to keep the tune for the dance, which didn't bother her. There was a curious thing when we danced, though. She seemed to slide across the floor and never lifted her feet at all. When asked if he still sees Crescent, he said she's been a reoccurring figure in his life. The encounters have slowed down a lot, but Crescent was coming to see him very often, especially since she told him about the babies. Crescent was there, and she says the baby is here. I said, baby? What baby? Your baby. Show me my baby. But she wouldn't let him see at First, you must cradle it in your arms, and he was shown how to do it. It was 1968, and Janet Demarest was 9 years old. She was playing with some of her friends a short distance from her house. During this otherwise pleasant childhood experience, she first encountered something from another world. She was hypnotized by alien abduction investigator David M. Jacobs, and her story was told in his 1992 book, Secret Life: First-Hand Documented Accounts of UFO Abductions. Jacobs asked the hypnotized Demarest to describe what the children were doing. They were sitting in the grass, and her friends seemed to be looking at something on the ground. Janet initially sat with him, but decided to stand up and watch the situation from a distance. Taking a few steps away from them, they mostly ignored her, continuing to stare at the mysterious object on the ground, which she assumed was a bug or something. Suddenly, she noticed a man standing outside the circle. When asked to describe him, she said he doesn't look human. Her friends were all still in the circle, and they didn't notice the strange humanoid. Janet felt compelled to go where he was, and once he was by her side, they started walking. She had a feeling he knew where they were going. They walked into the forest. At this point in the hypnosis session, Janet began to question the story her memories were telling her. She couldn't understand why she would have just stood up and walked away from her friends to follow some humanoid. The creature was holding her hand, and she felt happy to go with him. She wanted to leave on her own. His hands were no bigger than hers, and she felt safe. They walked along the path in comfortable silence until they reached an open space when Janet saw something she couldn't recognize. It was a landed UFO, and a small humanoid carried her up the ramp to the ship. She was taken to a warehouse-like room where she saw a woman in a cradle and was described as not looking real. Similar to the man who brought her into the room, her skin was grayish and she was thin, but her bones were not visible. She looked like a shadow. Her arms were thin enough to feel disproportionately long, and her fingers were thin. The entity showed no bone structure, joints, or genitalia. Her toes were long, and she looked about 8 years old. She had a small nose, no chin, and a lipless mouth, and a bald head. She only felt the creature she was looking at was meant to be a girl based on what the creature that led her to the room told her. Janet and the male humanoid took a few steps towards the child and her mother, then sat down on the floor. Janet crossed her legs, and the humanoid girl mirrored this behavior. The male humanoid and the mother watched the two children on the floor, and Janet seems to remember asking her if she wanted to play, but the alien girl said she didn't know. Janet replied that she was thinking about the game before the girl interrupted her and said, "Sit there." She listened and quickly found that her eyes were somehow locked on the eyes of the alien. The stranger was also looking at her, but it was clear to Janet that she still had the ability to move her eyes. They both sit there, seemingly attached to each other because they were told to be, which Janet said seemed to be very important. Then the two children stood up, and apparently the stranger said to Janet, "It's time to go," saying goodbye before the pair shared a quick hug. Janet wrapped her arms around the creature, who felt completely solid. She couldn't feel any bone structure. The alien girl stood back at this point, and Janet began walking back over the hill to rejoin her friends. Her friends asked her where she had been, to which she seemingly replied that she was just exploring, and that seemed to satisfy them. The hypnotist thought it was strange, almost as if the children were switched on again. in 1987 when Janet was 33 years old. A humanoid being was with her holding a long metal object similar to a needle. He moved to insert the needle in Janet's body, and she knew it would hurt. However, she felt no pain when the figure inserted the needle into her vagina. She saw that he had put something in her body, a small spherical object. She was too scared to move. After the strange procedure was over, the female humanoid helped Janet sit up from the table, pushing her into a sitting position. All Janet could do was think at the moment she wanted a child. She told the being this, but no response from the expressionless humanoid. Janet felt like she was going to have a baby. She was completely captivated by the idea, even though she had never wanted to get pregnant before this experience. At a point in her life, Janet had gone to the doctor to terminate a fetus she was pregnant with, but the doctor was shocked when there was no fetus in her womb. He was so confused that he became angry at the nurse who somehow caused the phantom pregnancy. Janet saw the nurse motioning to the doctor to hush him, fearing that Janet could hear his anger and confusion and cause her to panic. And some of Janet's later accounts of what she experienced, she relates to her daughter Hillary, suggesting that she might have been inspired by her previous experience to have a baby. The abduction phenomenon seemed to spread to her daughter when she was 6 years old. Janet always slept in the same bed as Hillary, perhaps to keep her from the aliens. During one incident, she was conscious at the start of the abduction. She was able to tell this story without the aid of hypnosis. She said she saw an object that resembled a laundry basket appear out of nowhere and hover over her child. She saw a small gray creature standing by her bed and suddenly found herself paralyzed and unable to scream. Her daughter suddenly disappeared from the bed. After the basket reappeared, Janet felt nauseous and the strange feeling that she was now in the basket and moving. Soon after the basket returned her to the empty bed, she lay on her back as the basket above her head disappeared, and before quickly reappearing to reveal her daughter by her side once again. She awoke to find Hillary complaining of pains in her arm and various other places. Janet examined her daughter. Her stomach dropped in horror when she noticed Hillary's genitals were red, swollen, and oozing a clear substance. A brown substance was painted between her thighs. She panicked and quickly tried to wipe the substance off her daughter, but it quickly dried, turned white, and evaporated. Janet found flakes of material substance on the sheets and an unusual stain. After a thorough search of the bedroom, she kept the flakes in an airtight jar in the freezer, but it only took a few days for them to evaporate too. The same thing happened to Hillary just a month later, and this time Janet was much more prepared. She peeled off all the brown material before wiping the rest with toilet paper. She put the scraped material in the freezer, but it disappeared again within days. The next abduction incident was described as Janet finding herself on a table with two beings holding her shoulders and her head tilted back at a sharp angle as if trying to look directly behind her. Her body was rigid, and the creatures on her shoulders watched her intensely while the third underwent some indescribable gynecological procedure. The next day, she suffered neck and shoulder cramps. The pain was constant for 24 hours. She explained the general disconnection and surreal nature of her experiences, saying that she had no idea who she was when she was with the creatures. She says one incident happens, then the next, and she forgets the first. These fragmented memories could only be recovered through hypnosis. Pamela Stonebrook's first extraterrestrial experience were non-sexual and occurred when she was only 9 years old. Her first strange experience was finding two unusual scars on her skin. At the time, she had no idea where they came from. They had seemingly just showed up. As she got older and more experienced, she realized they were likely what she referred to as scoop marks from extraterrestrial tissue sampling. The marks may have appeared without explanation, but her first consciously remembered experience was about to occur. She eventually lost interest in the extraterrestrial phenomenon and instead focused on her music career. However, she continued to maintain an interest in the paranormal through the lens of astral travel. She later admitted to being an experienced out-of-body traveler. In 1994, Pamela was working as a celebrity agent in Houston, Texas. She hadn't yet started her star career as a jazz singer, but the aliens didn't seem to care much if she was a celebrity herself or not. That day, she had just come home from a long shift in her office and decided to go to bed early. She closed her eyes and fell asleep peacefully, but when she woke up, she realized she wouldn't be able to return to her office that morning. She was curled up in the fetal position in a dimly lit metal pyramid room, and the realization quickly dawned on her that she must be on a spaceship. A group of small gray-skinned creatures entered the room and looked at her. One of them, probably a woman, approached her and told her not to be afraid, asking her to follow them. Realizing she had no other real option, she followed the gray stranger through the door into another room. The stranger closed the door behind her, and it immediately disappeared into the wall. Turning to watch the door disappear, she was surprised to see three even smaller female aliens staring at her. She described them as very frail, like the rest, with thin hair on their heads. They ran up to her, grabbed her hands, and started calling her Mama. A wave of fear suddenly hit her, leaving her speechless in utter terror before suddenly finding herself back in her bed. Jumping out of bed, she was still in a panic. She went to the bathroom to splash water on her face to shake off what she could only think of as a dream. When she did, she had to roll up her sleeves, horrified to see many small bruises on her arms. The reality of the experience immediately flooded to her mind, and she remembered how the aliens had grabbed her arms. Returning to bed, still frightened and unable to sleep properly, the experience affected her sleep for almost a year. Pamela finally agreed to undergo hypnotic regression to try to find more memories of the extraterrestrial contact, and she was horrified by what was revealed. As she began to remember more and more, she realized the alien Grace had done several studies on her over the years, and that the aliens were responsible for the 4 phantom pregnancies she had experienced. The aliens also showed her an apocalyptic vision of the future. She always thought it was quite ridiculous, and actually spent the first year and a half reminiscing about it all, feeling really traumatized by it. But despite that, she was able to accept it as part of herself. She started a support group for people who had experienced similar phenomena. Pamela told The Sun online that she was able to get over her embarrassment fairly quickly and told her friends and family about what had happened to her. She used her music to spread some of the messages conveyed in her support group. Her song Alien includes a part where she reads a message from the aliens through a voice modulator. In 1998, the encounters with aliens turned erotic. She had a deal with 3 extraordinary sexually gifted reptilian spacemen. The first of these illicit encounters began when she woke up from a dream to find herself already having sex with a handsome blonde man who she compared to a Greek god. She was shocked because she never brought people home like she apparently had that night, and finally concluded that she must have been lucid dreaming. She closed her eyes and relaxed, enjoying how comfortable the unfamiliar presence made her feel. When she opened her eyes, the supposed dream turned something much less ordinary. Her partner became more aggressive. The energy felt completely different, and apparently her partner inexplicably grew in size. The Greek god transformed into a 6-foot-tall reptilian humanoid with a vaguely alligator-like snout and scaly snake-like skin. She realized that she was falling in love with this shape-shifting space creature, and when it sensed she was scared, he just whispered, "We've always been together. We love each other." The telepathic communication she shared with the reptile was apparently so intense and sensual that she felt lucky to be able to enjoy an intensely pleasurable sexual experience. She described the reptile as sly and slick with a playful kind of bad boy attitude. The orgasms she experienced were unlike anything she had felt ever. It was as if the climax reached every cell of her body. She hired an artist to draw one of the reptilians she remembered interacting with. She later appeared on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell to share her experiences. She said she often received letters and emails from women who were relieved to know someone else had experienced something similar.